By the dawn of the 14th century, Europe was a world stretched to its breaking point. For nearly 300 years, a period of unusually warm weather known as the medieval warm period had blessed the continent. Fields yielded bountiful harvests, and populations boomed. Cities, once small outposts, now swelled with people. From the bustling ports of Italy to the crowded streets of Paris and London, humanity was everywhere. But this growth was built on a fragile foundation. The land itself was groaning under the pressure. Forests were cleared, marshes were drained, and every available scrap of earth was put to the plow. Yet it wasn't enough. The continent was teetering on the edge of a great famine, a Malthusian crisis in the making. This teeming world was organized by a rigid, unyielding structure, the feudal system. At the very top sat the king, God's chosen ruler, who owned all the land. Below him were the powerful nobles and high clergy, granted vast estates in exchange for loyalty and military service. Further down were the knights, the warrior class, bound by oaths to protect their lords. And at the very bottom, forming the massive base of this human pyramid, were the peasants and serfs. They were tied to the land, their lives a cycle of relentless labor for the benefit of those above them. This system, once a source of stability, had become a prison. There was little hope for change, little room for movement. It was a world set in stone, a world waiting for a shock to shatter its very foundations.
In the vast heart of Asia, a silent killer stirred. A bacterium, Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas on the backs of black rats. For centuries, it lay dormant in isolated pockets, but the 14th century's interconnected world would become its highway. The Mongol Empire, with its sprawling trade routes, unknowingly rolled out a black carpet for the plague. From the arid plains, it hitched a ride on merchant caravans. Goods moved, and so did death. The first major leap was west, along the Silk Road, a lifeline of commerce that was about to become a conduit of catastrophe. By 1346, the plague had reached the Black Sea, at the Genoese trading post of Katha. During a Mongol siege, a grim new form of biological warfare was born. Infected corpses were catapulted over the city walls. Panic-stricken Genoese merchants fled by sea, but they couldn't outrun their microscopic stowaway. Their ships, laden with silks, spices, and the deadly secret, became floating coffins. They sailed into the great ports of the Mediterranean: Constantinople, Sicily, Genoa, Marseille. Each port they touched became a new epicenter. The sickness didn't care for wealth or status. It spread inland, following rivers, roads, and pilgrims. A dark stain crept across the map of Europe, consuming towns and cities with terrifying speed. What began as a distant rumor from the east had now arrived. The great mortality had begun its reign.
Imagine a world where, in the span of just a few years, nearly half the people you know, your family, your neighbors, are simply gone. This wasn't fiction. It was the brutal reality of the mid-14th century. To truly grasp the scale, we need to see it. Let's look at this chart. On the left, population in millions. Along the bottom, three major kingdoms: England, France, and Italy. These bars represent their thriving populations around the year 1346. First, focus on England, a land of roughly 4 million souls. The bar stands tall, a testament to its growth. Now watch, the year changes, 1348. The bar begins to shake. It starts to drop, slowly at first, then with terrifying speed. By 1351, it has collapsed, settling at just over 2 million, a 50% loss. Now look to France, the demographic giant of medieval Europe, with a population soaring near 17 million. Its bar dwarfs the others, but it is not spared. The shadow falls. The decline is catastrophic. The massive column shrinks, losing an estimated 6 to 8 million people. The very heart of the kingdom is bled dry. Finally, Italy, not a unified country, but a collection of bustling city-states, the hubs of Mediterranean trade. This connectivity becomes its curse. The population, around 12 million, is about to face the same fate. From Florence to Genoa, the Italian bar plummets. In some cities, the death toll reached 60%. The chart shows a civilization brought to its knees. In a handful of years, Europe lost a third to a half of its entire people. A void in history that would take centuries to fill.
Before the Great Mortality swept across the land, the economic world was a rigid, unyielding pyramid. At its peak, a small elite of lords and nobles, clad in fine silks, held dominion over vast tracts of land, the source of all wealth and power. At the broad base, a sea of peasants and serfs, their lives dictated by the seasons and the whims of their masters. They were bound to the soil, their labor abundant and therefore cheap. A single peasant was just another nameless, faceless, replaceable cog in an enormous, grinding machine. Their world was fixed. But then, the plague arrived, a phantom that cared not for status or station. And in its devastating wake, it left more than just silence and sorrow. It shattered the very foundations of that ancient pyramid. Suddenly, with nearly half the population gone, the fundamental laws of economics were violently inverted. The most valuable commodity was no longer endless acres of land, but the scarce, precious hands left to work it. The old order began to tremble. Rich, fertile fields lay fallow, choked with weeds, a silent testament to the missing farmers. Ripe harvests rotted on the vine, for there were not enough laborers to bring them in. Desperate landowners, watching their wealth wither away, were forced into a position they had never known. They had to compete. For the first time in centuries, the humble peasant, the survivor, held the cards. They could demand and receive higher wages, better food, shorter hours. They could abandon one lord for another who offered a better deal. The heavy chains of serfdom began to rust and snap. A great symbolic scale, for ages heavily weighted with a crown and a land deed on one side, now saw the other side, holding a simple scythe, rise and then crash down with newfound weight. The economic world had been turned completely upside down, and from its chaotic ruins, a new, more modern society was struggling to be born. Before the Great Mortality, the life of a common laborer was brutal and short. For centuries, a vast supply of desperate workers kept wages tragically low. But when the plague swept across Europe, it didn't just take lives, it shattered the old economic order. Suddenly, the most valuable commodity wasn't land or gold, it was labor. Lords and guild masters who once had an endless pool of workers were now desperate. Fields lay fallow and workshops fell silent. This unprecedented crisis created an equally unprecedented opportunity for the survivors. To truly understand this seismic shift, we need to look at the data, specifically at what economists call real wages, not just how many coins you earned, but what you could actually buy with them. Let's visualize this. Here is a graph. On the bottom, we have time, from the year 1300 to 1500. On the side, we have the purchasing power of daily wages. And right here, we mark the arrival of the Black Death. Now watch what happens to the wages of an unskilled laborer, a farmhand, or a ditch digger. Before the plague, their earnings are pitifully flat. Then, boom! In the decades that followed,
Their real wages more than doubled. A simple farm worker could now afford more bread, more ale, and better living conditions than their parents could have ever dreamed of. But what about skilled workers? The masons, the carpenters, the blacksmiths? Their story is even more dramatic. Starting from a higher baseline, their wages also exploded. Look at this line soar. They were in such high demand that they could often name their own price. This period has been called the Golden Age of the English laborer. For the first time in centuries, the balance of power had shifted. The common man, through the grim lottery of survival, had finally won a measure of economic freedom. The world would never be the same.
The great pestilence had passed, but the world it left behind was broken. In England, fields lay fallow, villages were quiet, and a third of the population was gone. The survivors, the common folk, suddenly held a power they'd never known: scarcity. With so few hands to till the soil or thatch a roof, their labor was now worth a fortune. They demanded higher wages, better conditions. Some simply packed their meager belongings and left their lords for better offers elsewhere. The aristocracy was aghast. Their world, built on a foundation of cheap, immobile labor, was crumbling. This wasn't just an economic crisis. It was a rebellion against the natural order of things. In a desperate act to chain the future to the past, the government, led by King Edward III, struck back. In 1351, a royal decree was issued, the Statute of Laborers. An ancient weathered scroll unrolls on screen. The camera pans across the Latin text. Key phrases glow with English translations. Every man and woman shall be bound to serve. Another line lights up. And take only the wages which were accustomed to be given. Wages were frozen to pre-plague levels. It became a crime to be idle. It was illegal to refuse work and illegal for an employer to offer more than the old rate. Lords were even given the power to imprison any worker who dared to leave their service. This wasn't just law. It was a declaration of war on the new economic reality. It was the old order, with its fists clenched, refusing to let go of a world that no longer existed.
Before the Great Dying, land was everything. It was wealth, power, and destiny, locked tight in the hands of a few. A peasant was born on a lord's land, worked that land, and died on that land. Their fate was tied to the soil, a bond as strong and unchangeable as iron. But then, the world broke. As the plague swept across the continent, it didn't just claim lives. It shattered the very foundation of this old world. Suddenly, there was a surplus of one thing: land. Vast estates, once priceless, were now eerily quiet, their fields fallow. There were not enough hands to work them. And for the first time, the value of land plummeted. We can see this dramatic shift in the records. A chart shows the price of an acre of farmland, stable for centuries, suddenly nosediving. At the same time, another line on our chart begins to spike upwards: the price of labor. A simple farmhand was now a rare and valuable commodity. The survivors found themselves in a new world of opportunity. The iron chains of serfdom began to rust and break. Why stay and toil for a pittance when a lord 2 valleys over was offering double the wages, better conditions, or even a piece of land to call your own? Peasants began to move, a concept almost unthinkable a generation before. They left their ancestral manners, seeking freedom and fortune. Many saved their new wages and did the impossible. They bought their own plots of land. This wasn't a revolution with swords and banners. It was a silent economic revolution. A fundamental reordering of society, born from immense tragedy, that planted the seeds for the end of feudalism and the rise of a new social class. For 1,000 years, the structure of society seemed as permanent as a mountain range, a great feudal pyramid, solid and unyielding. At its peak sat the king, his authority seemingly granted by the heavens. Just below, the powerful nobles and high clergy, the lords of the land and the shepherds of souls. And at the vast, sprawling base, the peasantry, bound to the soil they worked, their lives a predictable cycle of service and obligation. This order was considered natural, eternal, as if carved from a single block of stone. But even stone erodes. First came the cracks. The Black Death swept across the continent, a grim reaper that didn't distinguish between classes. It left a void, a desperate shortage of labor. Suddenly, the peasant at the bottom held a new kind of power. They could demand wages, better conditions, even their freedom. At the same time, away from the feudal manners, towns and cities were buzzing with new life, becoming vibrant hubs of trade and innovation. A different kind of power was growing here, measured not in acres of land, but in chests of coin. The merchant emerged, a master of trade routes and ledgers. The skilled artisan, banding together in guilds, controlled the creation of goods from cloth to steel. A new space was forming within the old pyramid. It wasn't at the top, nor was it at the bottom. The yeoman farmer, a freeman who owned his small plot of land, began to replace the bonded serf. The master craftsman, proud owner of his own workshop, answered to no lord. This wasn't a violent revolution that shattered the pyramid in an instant. It was a slow, seismic transformation. The rigid layers began to fracture and blur. And from those cracks, a new dynamic force was being forged, a middle class, ready to reshape the world not with a sword, but with a contract, a coin, and a hammer.
The great silence that followed the Black Death was not of peace, but of profound, unnerving absence. Across the continent, a third of its people were gone, erased from the tapestry of life. The old world's foundation, built on a vast supply of labor, had fractured. Feudal lords stared from their keeps, gazing upon unplowed, empty fields. City guilds, once bustling, were hollowed shells, lacking masters and apprentices. The rigid social pyramid, a structure that seemed eternal, was irrevocably broken. But from this devastation, an unexpected and powerful shift began to unfold. The survivors, the peasants, the artisans, found their world transformed. Their labor was now an incredibly precious commodity. For the first time, they held leverage. They could demand higher wages, fairer conditions. A migration began, as serfs left their manors, drawn by the promise of the cities. The aristocracy, unable to compel labor, had to adapt. They began leasing land for cash, paying workers in coin. This injected a torrent of capital into the economy. A new class of wealthy commoners emerged, their fortunes built not on lineage, but on business. This labor shortage also became an engine for innovation. Inventors sought new machines to make every pair of hands more productive. We see hints of technologies that would redefine the world, like the printing press. Psychologically, the plague shattered faith in old institutions. Survivors, having stared into the abyss, developed a new focus on the tangible world, on human potential. This wasn't recovery, it was a radical reinvention. Picture this contrast. On one side, the specter of the plague, ghost towns and mass graves. On the other, the seeds of the Renaissance, bustling markets, new universities, and patrons commissioning art. The Black Death was an unimaginable cataclysm, a crucible of suffering. But from its fire, a new Europe was forged, primed for a golden age of discovery, science, and exploration.